What's growing on, gardeners? It's Sunday, July 21st, and the peak summer heat is here on the southeastern coast of North Carolina. But just because it's the hottest week of the year doesn't mean we aren't still planting things out in our garden. And on today's video, I'm going to share with you 7 things that you can plant out into your garden right now in late July. I just planted all of these things this week, and some of them may surprise you.
If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and hit the bell to receive new video notifications, and check out our Amazon store and Spreadshop links in the video description for everything I use in my garden and awesome custom designed apparel and other gear. Your support is greatly appreciated.
Now, as a point of reference, I live on the southeastern coast of North Carolina, Zone 8B, just outside of the Wilmington, North Carolina area, and I typically have my first frost event of the year in early to mid-November. But for the purposes of this video, I'm assuming that you're going to get your first frost at some point in October. So since it's July 21st right now, if we assume that you have an October frost, that means that you basically have 75 to 100 frost-free days left in the season. And that is plenty of time to grow warm weather crops from seed right now. Crop number 1 that I sowed from seed this week, that virtually anybody can sow from seed right now, even in chilly locations, are green beans. Green beans are incredible because they germinate in a matter of only about 3 to 5 days, and they reach maturity very quickly. In fact, this Burpee's Tender Pod variety is only 50 days to maturity. I planted all of these string bean seeds in this bed on Wednesday afternoon, and here we are only 4 days later on Sunday afternoon, and almost all of the seeds have germinated already. That is how insanely fast string bean seeds germinate. So if you plant your string beans in late July, you will be harvesting fresh beans in September. Just do yourself a favor, and when selecting varieties, pick a low days to maturity variety like this Burpee's Tender Pod variety I showed you earlier in this video. This is only 50 days to maturity, so it's a good idea when planting fall crops that you pick something that is early and has a low days to maturity. Veggies 2 and 3 that I'm sowing right now in late July are cucumbers and zucchini. Yes, you heard me right. There is still plenty of time for the overwhelming majority of us to grow another crop of cucumbers and zucchini. That's because you can get cucumber and zucchini varieties that have insanely low days to maturity. For example, this Sure Thing hybrid summer squash right here, which is a zucchini, is only 48 days to maturity, and this Merlin cucumber right here is only 50 to 55 days to maturity. And because your cucurbit seeds germinate in only about 3 to 4 days, that means roughly from the day you sow that seed, you will be 60 days or less away from picking your first fruits. I just transplanted 3 zucchini and 2 cucumber plants in this bed this week. They've only been in ground for 3 days. Now, these are transplants, so that means I sowed these seeds into my transplant trays 3 weeks ago, but because these transplants have already taken hold, I will be eating off of these plants in roughly only 1 month. And in this bed right here, I also sowed 4 more zucchini and 1 cucumber that you see back here. So I actually have 2 new beds that I just planted out with cucumber and zucchini plants. But the brilliance of this method comes from the succession planting aspect. You see, those transplants are 3 to 4 weeks old from the day I sowed that seed, so obviously they're going to give me a big jump start versus if you haven't started seed yet. That is where more seed starting comes into play. Because I just placed those transplants, what I want to do right now is follow up in a different bed with a direct sowing of cucumber and zucchini. Because once they germinate, they will basically be 1 month behind my crop of zucchini and cucumbers that I just transplanted. You see, cucumbers and zucchini generally have a short lifespan of only about 2 months after you transplant them, so they aren't going to make it through the end of the season. If I plant another succession planting from seed right now, by the time they actually germinate, they will be a month behind those plants. So I'm basically planting 2 crops at the exact same time, the transplanted crop and the direct sown crop. And when you add them both together, they will carry me until the end of the year with harvests. Veggies 4 and 5 that literally everybody can start from seed right now and that I just started from seed this week are leeks and bunching onions. And these are different than any of the other veggies that I listed so far because these can tolerate severe frost and freeze. In fact, if you plant these in late summer, beginning of fall, and they become well established and fairly matured and hardened off before your frosts and freezes start, I have never found a temperature where these take cold damage. Now, here in Zone 8, I only get down into the teens every single winter, but I have heard some varieties of bunching onions, which you harvest for the greenery, and leeks, which you also harvest from the greenery, being able to stand 0 degrees Fahrenheit out in the open, maybe even colder, if you start them early enough where they can become fully matured and hardened off before the heavy frosts and freezes start. So if you live in a very far northern climate and sometimes you feel like you get left out of what you can grow in many of my videos, say you live in Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Milwaukee, or all of the other really cold northern places that tend to begin with the letter M, definitely consider giving these a try. You can plant these right now. Now, when growing onions, leeks, and other alliums like that, the seeds are very tiny and they don't do very well when you direct sow them into your garden because the slightest bit of rain or irrigation can wash them away and they need to be sown very shallow. So I strongly recommend you actually start them in seed trays. This is what you can see 5 days after planting. I sowed them in my sunroom where it gets nice and warm during the day, and they germinated really well so far. They're not completely done germinating, but these will probably be ready for transplanting out into my garden in a month. Now, as I mentioned, I recommend the overwhelming majority of people grow bunching onions this time of year if you want to harvest them for the greenery. They're sold as green onions or spring onions in the grocery store, by the way. The reason why I recommend most people grow them is because they are the most cold hardy of the onions. However, just for fun this year, I'm growing instead some bulbing onions and some shallots. Now, these are not nearly as cold hardy, but I have very mild winters, and I figure I'm going to try this as an experiment to see if I can get the onions to bulb off season. I don't think it's going to succeed, but because my winters are so mild, I can have the flexibility of growing a bulbing onion and harvest that for the green onion tops if I wish. So if you live in a place with very mild winters and you don't have yourself bunching onion seeds, you can consider growing a bulbing onion as well. Just don't expect them to develop very significant or any bulbs at all because they generally need the long days of the spring and summer to do so. Crop number 6 that I just sowed in my garden this week is definitely the most challenging on the list, and that is sweet corn. Fall corn is a very common crop that is grown in the South. However, it does take more days to maturity than most of the things on this video. So if you're thinking about growing fall corn, if you live in a place that gets frost and freeze, it is very important you jump and you do this right away. Now, this variety of corn right here that I'm planting is peaches and cream. It is 83 days to maturity, so this is like a mid-season corn. I sure wish I had an earlier variety that was in the 65 to 70 day range. I didn't have any seeds of earlier corn and I wasn't going to go out and get any. This is just some old seed I had, so it's basically free. I'm just running this as an experiment. But many of us that do not see frost and freeze until late October or November can plant some early corn right now. Again, I recommend that you pick an earlier variety than this, something in the 65 to 70 days to maturity range, or at least get something under 75 days to maturity. The earlier you go, the more success you will probably have. But these are very easy to plant. I transplanted them out into my garden bed 2 days ago. They haven't germinated yet, but I'm taking a risk, and I think many of us can still be successful if we select varieties that are early enough and we fertilize them aggressively enough to give them lots of nitrogen and help push them along. The fertilizing is going to be very important this time of year. Something water soluble and strong like a Jack's 20-20-20 is really going to be mandatory to really kick them in the butt and push them along and get them to grow and put on top growth as quickly as possible. It's a challenge, but you can do it. So if you want to accept the challenge, give sweet corn a try. And plant number 7 that I just planted this week is actually a category of plant, and it's going to shock many of you, and that is fruit trees. I actually planted 2 different fruit trees this week. I planted a citrus tree right here and an avocado tree right here. And that is going to surprise a lot of people because the overwhelming majority of people believe that spring is the best time to plant trees. And that is actually not necessarily true. The reason why the overwhelming majority of people plant fruit trees in spring isn't because it's the best time to plant fruit trees in most cases. Here on the southeastern coast of North Carolina, spring is actually one of the worst times to plant a fruit tree because it's usually our driest period of the year. The reason why we often have to settle for spring plantings is because that is when most nurseries start shipping out the new trees for the season. You place your pre-orders in fall and early winter, and then they start shipping out the fruit trees in late winter, beginning of spring. So we wind up getting these bare root fruit trees that are delivered to us in March and April, so we really have no choice but to plant them in ground at that time, even though it's usually not a good time. When you order a fruit tree, you will either get one of two types of fruit tree, a bare root fruit tree or an actively growing fruit tree. All of these fruit trees that you see planted in a row right here, I bought as bare root fruit trees last fall. They shipped over the winter, and I planted them all in the ground in, I think, late February. So for me here on the southeastern coast of North Carolina, our driest season of the year is usually from the end of March until the middle of May. So I can't plant my fruit trees at that time because it's so dry, I'd have to be out watering them every single day. So it's really important that when I receive them in late winter, they go in ground as soon as possible while it's still relatively damp and cool. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for them to establish. Now, the absolute best time to plant a fruit tree in a place like where I live is actually during the rainy season, and that is right now in mid-July. Because we're getting almost daily afternoon thunderstorms, it is highly beneficial to plant them now because it's usually our cloudiest time of the year, the most humid time of the year, and the wettest time of the year. So I actually have to water them less because Mother Nature waters them for me. So if you live in a humid place that gets monsoon-type rains like we do in the southeast, or maybe even the southwest where it cools down a little bit in your July and August time frame, that actually may be a pretty good time to plant your actively growing trees. Now, if you live in a colder climate and you're going to plant a very cold, hardy deciduous tree that goes deep into dormancy in the winter, I would say the fall is probably the best time to plant things like apples, peaches, and pears, and things of that nature that have a strong dormancy. But for somebody like me in the southeast, if I'm going to grow an evergreen tree or something that's already actively growing and is not dormant, this is actually a really good time to do so because of the daily rains, the excessive cloud cover, because it's really clear and sunny here the other 8 or 9 months of the year most of the time, which is challenging to grow trees. So think about your environmental factors when you're planting. Obviously, if you live on the west coast where you get almost no rain and no clouds this time of year, you will be an exception. But for many of us that get a lot of humidity and rainfall and cloud cover, this may be a really good time for you to plant some trees. And that right there are 7 things the overwhelming majority of people can plant in late July. Like I said, I just planted all of these things this week. And while there may be some exceptions, like people at very high latitudes with very short climates, or if you live on the West Coast, the whole tree planting thing may not work out for you. But for the overwhelming majority of people, this will be a pretty good guide as to when you can do things. That's why I included my zone information. So if you're in a zone that's much warmer than mine, you may have to delay a little bit, but hey, you'll have this information out in front of you so you can plan ahead. So everybody, I sure hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and please ring that notification bell so you're notified when I release more videos like these. If you're curious about anything that I use in real life in my garden, everything I use is linked down in my Amazon storefront link in the video description. So expand the video description, click on the Amazon storefront link, and you'll see everything I use in real life. And while you're down there, please check out my spread shop for custom merch if you want to support the channel. I'll also place a few links to some seed packets that I featured in this video if you want these exact varieties. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see all of you again on the next video. Well, the pomegranate's coming along, the avocado I just planted is coming along, all of the citrus is looking good, some of it is even flowering, and hey, look who it is. Is that my hunting dog just guarding the garden? What do you think, buddy? That looks pretty comfy right there. We're sitting in the shade. It's still pretty hot out in the sun, but here in the shade, it's pretty darn nice, right, buddy? Are you enjoying this day? Look at this. You have some juice on your nose from all the investigating you do. Oh,
some good scratches behind that ear. The harder you scratch, the more Dale likes it. It looks like you're smiling, buddy. You're smiling by the miles. So handsome.